What would you do if your only child spat on everything you'd sacrificed for them? When my daughter slapped down a credit card statement showing $198,403 spent in just 6 months, then looked me in the eyes and said, "I think you can help with the rest," I made the most painful decision of my life. I decided to disappear, not physically but financially, to become a failure, a cautionary tale, a man who'd lost everything. For 2 long years I lived in a workshop behind an old grocery store, selling off possessions, spreading rumors of my financial ruin, watching my reputation crumble, all to teach my daughter the value of what she'd taken for granted. But when she showed up on my doorstep with a child in her arms, a granddaughter I never knew existed, I realized the true cost of the lesson I'd tried to teach. Sometimes the most expensive silence is the one that costs you everything to maintain. If you've ever had to make an impossible choice between truth and love, if you've ever wondered what happens when tough love goes too far, this is a story that will break your heart before putting it back together. Follow our channel, like this video, and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. This is a journey you won't want to miss. I used to say my daughter was my living legacy. After my wife passed away, Ellie was all that remained of the woman I'd loved for 34 years. I held her hand at the funeral and silently promised I'd look after her until the last white hair fell from my head. Little did I know that one day she would spit on all of that. Literally. The scene that's forever burned into my mind happened on a cold January morning in Ashland, Kentucky. The kind of morning where your breath hangs in the air like a ghost that won't leave. I was sitting at my kitchen table, nursing a cup of coffee that had gone cold, just like my heart was about to. The door flew open with a bang that made the windows rattle. Ellie stomped in, her designer boots tracking melting snow across the hardwood floors her mother had lovingly polished every Sunday for 3 decades. Without a word, she slapped down a credit card statement on the table in front of me. $198,403.27 in 6 months. My hands trembled as I picked up those pages, line after line of extravagance that made my stomach turn. Cosmetic procedures at clinics with French names I couldn't pronounce. First-class tickets to Dubai. Shoes that cost more than my first car. A weekend shopping spree in Manhattan that could have paid for a year of college. My retirement fund. The safety net I'd built over 40 years of waking up at 4:30 every morning to work at the steel mill. Disappearing into the hands of strangers who sold her things she'd forget about by next Tuesday. Then came the moment that changed everything. Ellie looked me directly in the eyes, not as the little girl who once climbed into my lap when thunderstorms frightened her, but as if I were nothing more than an ATM with a pulse. Her gaze was cold, entitled, expectant. "I think you can help with the rest," she said, her voice as sharp as the icicles hanging from my gutters. Not a question, a statement, as if my life's work existed solely to fund her emptiness. I didn't yell, didn't lecture her about responsibility or the value of a dollar, didn't remind her that her mother would have wept to see what she'd become. I simply stood up, walked to the sink and washed my hands. Slowly, methodically, the water running over my calloused fingers, fingers that had once bandaged her skinned knees and braided her hair for school pictures. In that moment, with water dripping from my weathered hands, I made a decision that would either save my daughter or lose her forever. I decided to disappear. Not physically, though God knows I considered it. No, I would disappear financially. The bank account she saw as bottomless would suddenly run dry. The father she took for granted would become the father who had nothing left to give. As I turned off the faucet and reached for the dish towel, I caught my reflection in the window above the sink. My father's eyes looked back at me, the same eyes that had watched me make my own mistakes, painful as they were, because he knew I needed to learn through consequence, not lecture. "Dad?" Ellie's voice had an edge of impatience. "Did you hear what I said?" I turned to face her, this beautiful stranger wearing my daughter's face. I nodded slowly, my silence speaking volumes she wasn't yet equipped to understand. "I heard you," I finally said, my voice steady despite the earthquake happening in my chest. "I heard every word you didn't say too." Confusion flickered across her face, quickly replaced by irritation. She checked her watch, a Rolex I'd never seen before, and sighed dramatically. "Look, I don't have time for one of your life lessons right now. My flight to Aspen leaves in 3 hours, and I need to know if you're covering this or not." I folded the dish towel neatly, placing it on the counter with a precision that would have made her mother proud. Then I said the 5 words that would set everything in motion. "I can't help you anymore." She laughed. actually laughed as if I'd told a joke so absurd it didn't deserve serious consideration. Very funny, Dad. But seriously, I need to know. I'm serious, Eleanor, I said, using her full name for the first time since her high school graduation. The well has run dry. Her face transformed, cycling through disbelief, anger, and then something I'd never seen directed at me before: contempt. She snatched her designer purse from the table. Fine. I'll figure it out myself. I always do. As she stormed toward the door, she turned back one last time. Her eyes narrowed, her lips twisted into something ugly and unfamiliar. You know what Mom used to say about you? That your greatest weakness was that you never knew when to say no. Looks like she was wrong about that too. Then she did something I'll never forget as long as I live. She spat. Right there on her mother's handmade quilt that draped over the back of the sofa. A small, deliberate act of desecration that told me everything I needed to know about how far we'd fallen. The door slammed behind her with a finality that shook the house to its foundations. I stood there, perfectly still, listening to her car engine roar to life and then fade into the distance. Only then did I allow myself to sink into my chair, my hands shaking as I reached for the phone. I had calls to make, a plan to set in motion, a daughter to save, even if she hated me for it. Sometimes love means letting someone fall so they can learn to stand on their own. And sometimes the most expensive silence is the one that cost you everything to maintain. That night, I sat alone in my old shed out back, the one place Ellie never bothered to visit. It smelled of sawdust and motor oil, honest smells that reminded me of a time when I still knew who I was. The single bulb hanging from the ceiling cast harsh shadows across my workbench as I pulled out the battered toolbox where I kept my most valuable documents. Not tools for building furniture, but tools for building a life. Property deeds, stock certificates, insurance policies, the title to my home. My hands trembled as I sorted through them. These weren't just papers. They were the physical manifestation of every extra shift I'd worked, every vacation I'd skipped, every small luxury I'd denied myself to secure my family's future. A future that now seemed as hollow as the feeling in my chest. I wasn't just going to take away her money. I was going to take away my name, the name that, until now, had meant something in our small Kentucky town. The name that opened doors at banks and earned respectful nods at church socials. I would become a failure, a cautionary tale, a man who'd lost everything, all carefully planned. My bankruptcy wouldn't be legal, it would be emotional, a staged collapse designed to teach her the value of a brick before she demanded a castle. She needs to feel the weight of it, I whispered to the empty shed, my voice sounding foreign even to my own ears. The weight of having nothing. I started making lists, assets to sell, debts to manufacture, rumors to strategically place. The truck would go first. My beloved F-150 that had carried everything from Ellie's first bicycle to her college furniture. Then the vacation cabin in Gatlinburg where we'd spent summers watching fireflies and roasting marshmallows. The fishing boat. The collector's watches. Everything except this house, which held too many memories of her mother for me to part with, though I'd need to make it look like it was at risk. As my pen scratched across the paper, I tried to ignore the voice in my head that sounded suspiciously like my late wife. James, it whispered, is this really the way? What choice do I have, Margaret? I answered aloud, the habit of speaking to her never quite gone even after 7 years. She'll destroy herself if I don't stop her now. I created a fake email account in my name and sent inquiries to local loan sharks, people who might mention to others that old Jim Elliott was desperate for cash. I drafted a letter to the church requesting assistance with utility bills. I even made a list of friends to approach for loans I had no intention of taking, just enough people to ensure word would spread. With each item I added, the knot in my throat grew tighter. What I was about to do felt simultaneously like the most loving and most terrible act of my life. What's worse, losing a daughter to a lie, or watching her be devoured by the truth of her own making? Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the shed's windows like someone trying to get in, or perhaps like someone trying to warn me to stop. I ignored it and kept writing. By the time the eastern sky began to lighten with the first hint of dawn, my plan was complete. On paper, it looked clinical, strategic, 12 steps to financial ruin. In reality, each step felt like driving a nail into my own coffin. The reputation I'd spent a lifetime building would be dismantled in weeks. Friends would whisper, neighbors would speculate. The bank manager who'd shaken my hand every Friday for 20 years would soon avoid eye contact. I folded the paper and tucked it into my wallet, behind the faded photo of Ellie on her graduation day. Eyes bright with promise, smile wide with the certainty that the world was hers for the taking. That girl seemed like a stranger now. As I locked the shed and walked back to the house, the frost crunched beneath my feet, each step as brittle as I felt inside. The windows of our home, my home, were dark. Ellie hadn't come back. Part of me wondered if she ever would, once word got out that her father could no longer fund her lifestyle. Inside, I went straight to Margaret's sewing room, which I'd left untouched since her passing. Her presence was strongest here, in the half-finished quilt still stretched across her frame, the pin cushion still bristling with needles, waiting for hands that would never return. I sat in her chair, closed my eyes, and let the familiar scent of lavender and cotton envelop me. "I don't know if I'm doing the right thing, Maggie," I whispered, "but I know doing nothing would be wrong." The silence that answered me was neither comforting nor condemning. It simply was, like the silence that had grown between Ellie and me over the years, widening from a crack to a chasm without either of us noticing until it was too late to easily cross. Before leaving the room, I took one of Margaret's embroidery envelopes from her desk. Inside, I placed a small note with 3 words written in my shaky handwriting, "For when it hurts." I sealed it and tucked it into the locked box in my bedroom closet, the one place I knew Ellie might look if she ever truly needed something from me beyond my wallet. By noon that day, I'd made the first call, to the dealership where I'd bought every vehicle since 1982. By dinner, I'd signed the paper selling my truck for far less than it was worth. The dealer, an old fishing buddy, had asked no questions beyond, "You sure about this, Jim?" I'd nodded, not trusting my voice to hold steady if I spoke. As I walked the 3 miles home in the fading winter light, trucks and cars passing me on the road I'd driven countless times, I felt the first tangible loss of my self-imposed downfall. But with each step, I reminded myself, this isn't about what I'm losing. It's about what Ellie might find, herself, buried beneath all that empty wanting. 3 weeks passed before I saw Ellie again. 3 weeks of methodical self-destruction, selling assets, closing accounts, letting my phone ring to voicemail when creditors I'd intentionally angered called. 3 weeks of watching my neighbors' expressions shift from friendly waves to concerned glances to awkward avoidance. The rumors had taken root, growing wild like kudzu over my carefully tended reputation. I'd rented a small workshop behind Miller's old grocery store in Moorhead, about 30 minutes from my house. It was little more than a storage room with a bathroom so tiny you had to step outside to change your mind. But it had high ceilings, good light, and, most importantly, it looked exactly like the kind of place a man who'd lost everything might end up. I was arranging my woodworking tools when I heard the distinctive sound of heels clicking against concrete. Not work boots or sensible shoes, but the sharp, insistent tap of expensive stilettos. My heart skipped painfully in my chest. I knew that sound, had been waiting for it, dreading it, hoping for it. The door swung open without a knock, letting in a blast of spring air that carried the scent of designer perfume. Something French and probably worth a week of groceries per ounce. And there she stood, my daughter, framed in the doorway like an apparition. Ellie wore a silk dress the color of champagne that probably cost more than most people in town made in a month. Her hair was swept up in some complicated arrangement that looked both effortless and like it required 3 people to create. And those shoes, Lord, those shoes. Red-soled with heels so high she seemed to be walking on her tiptoes, barely making contact with the earth beneath her, as if touching the same ground as ordinary people was something she'd evolved beyond. For a moment, we just stared at each other. I noticed the flicker of shock in her eyes as she took in my appearance. I'd lost weight, intentionally skipping meals to create the gaunt look of a man in crisis. My clothes, once neat and pressed, thanks to habits Margaret had instilled, now hung loose and wrinkled. I'd even let my silver hair grow unkempt and my beard go scraggly. The transformation was calculated, but the weariness behind my eyes was real enough. So, Ellie's voice echoed in the nearly empty space as she stepped inside, her gaze sweeping over the folding cot in the corner, the hot plate on a milk crate, the single chair at a makeshift desk. "It's true then? You broke. And now?" She said it like she was commenting on the weather, not acknowledging the complete upheaval of her father's life. Her expression was a complex mixture of disbelief, contempt, and something else. Something that might have been fear if I didn't know better. I set down the hammer I'd been holding and straightened my back, feeling every one of my 68 years in the protest of my spine. "Now it's your turn to build," I said simply. Her perfectly sculpted eyebrows rose slightly, and then, to my surprise, she laughed. Not the genuine laugh I remembered from when she was young, but something brittle and sharp-edged, like glass about to shatter. "Build?" She gestured around the workshop with a manicured hand. "What exactly am I supposed to build, Dad? A life like this? Is this some kind of twisted object lesson?" I didn't answer immediately. Instead, I pulled out the single chair and offered it to her. She looked at it as if I'd offered her a seat in a puddle, but after a moment's hesitation, she perched on the edge, careful to keep her dress from touching any part of the weathered wood. "You know what's funny?" she continued, not waiting for my response. "Mom always said you were the strong one. The rock. The one who would move mountains before he'd let his family down." Her voice took on a mocking tone. Guess she was wrong about that too. Each word was precisely aimed, designed to find the cracks in my resolve. She'd always been smart that way, knowing exactly where to press to make it hurt. But what she didn't realize was that I'd been preparing for this, steeling myself against the very weapons I'd taught her to use through years of giving in. "Your mother," I said carefully, "knew the difference between being strong and being a doormat. I forgot that distinction for a while. I'm remembering it now." Ellie's eyes narrowed. "You always had a way of making your failures sound noble. You've always been afraid of me actually needing you. That's why you're hiding behind accounts and debts now." That accusation, so backward, so painfully wrong, hit me like a physical blow. I had to turn away, busying myself with arranging tools that were already perfectly aligned. How could she not see that everything, every extra shift, every sacrifice, every dollar saved, had been for her? That my greatest fear wasn't her needing me, but her never learning to need herself? "Is that what you think this is about?" I finally asked, my voice rough with emotion I refused to let her see. "Fear? What else could it be?" She stood, her movement fluid despite those impossible heels. "You had everything, and then suddenly, conveniently, right when I needed your help, it all disappears. You expect me to believe that's coincidence?" I turned back to face her. "No, not coincidence." For just a moment, something like understanding flickered across her face. Then it hardened into resolve as she reached for her purse. Another designer item that probably cost more than my monthly rent. "Well, I guess we both know where we stand now," she said coolly. "Don't worry about me, Dad. I'll figure it out on my own. I always do." As she headed for the door, I called after her. "Ellie, the money was never the point." She paused, her hand on the doorknob, but didn't turn around. "Then what was?" "The point is, what you become when it's gone." She stood frozen for a beat, her shoulders tense beneath the delicate silk. Then, without another word, she walked out, the door closing behind her with a finality that echoed in the empty workshop. Through the dusty window, I watched her climb into a luxury car I didn't recognize, probably rented or borrowed from one of her wealthy friends. As she drove away, I noticed she'd left something behind, a faint impression of those red-soled shoes in the dust of my floor, heading away from me. What she didn't notice was the locked cabinet in the corner where I'd stored my old pocket watch, and the envelope with those 3 handwritten words, "For when it hurts." Some lessons can't be taught. They can only be learned through experience. And some treasures can only be found after you've lost everything else. I returned to my tools, hands steadier now that the confrontation was over. The path ahead would be harder than either of us knew, but at least now we were both walking it. The seasons changed twice, and Ellie vanished from my life like morning mist burned away by harsh sun. 2 Kentucky summers came and went, their humid embrace wrapping around my solitary existence like a wool blanket that's both comforting and suffocating. Fall painted the hills in fire colors before winter stripped them bare again. Through it all, I maintained my charade of financial ruin with the dedication of a method actor who's forgotten there's a world outside his role. My workshop became my home in more than just the literal sense. I filled it with the rhythmic sounds of hand tools against wood. No power equipment, both to save on electricity and to extend the time each project required. The local widows and retirees brought me broken chairs to fix, tables to refinish, and sometimes just coffee and conversation. To them, I was poor Jim Elliot, the once successful man who'd lost everything through some combination of bad luck and bad decisions that they never quite pinned down. Their pity was a currency I spent carefully, letting it buy me just enough connection to stave off complete isolation, without inviting questions I couldn't answer. I cooked soup in pots sized for a family that no longer existed, and fell asleep to the sound of radio programs that reminded me of simpler times. My actual house stood empty most days, a museum of memories I visited only when necessary to maintain appearances. I'd kept it through clever legal maneuvering, putting it in a trust that appeared depleted to anyone who might check but actually remained secure, a safeguard for when, if, my plan ever reached its conclusion. On particularly quiet evenings, I'd find myself talking to Margaret as if she were sitting across from me, her knitting needles clicking softly as she listened. "I don't know if she's coming back, Maggie," I confessed one such night watching moths dance around the single bulb hanging from my ceiling. "Maybe I've pushed her too far. Maybe I've lost her completely." The silence that answered me was profound, broken only by the distant whistle of a freight train passing through town. Those trains had been the soundtrack of my childhood, their mournful call promising destinations I'd never see. Now they just reminded me of connections missed and journeys interrupted. It was Mrs. Abernathy who brought me the first news of Ellie in all that time. She came by with a peach cobbler still warm from the oven, her gray hair neatly pinned in the same style she'd worn since the 1970s. "Saw your girl yesterday," she said casually, as if she weren't delivering words that stopped my heart mid-beat. "At that job fair they held over at the community college." My hands froze on the cabinet hinge I'd been fixing. "Ellie? At a job fair?" Mrs. Abernathy nodded, her eyes sharp with the curiosity she was too polite to voice directly. "Looked different. Hair pulled back plain. No fancy clothes. And..." She hesitated, then added with careful delicacy, "She's in a family way, I'd say. Quite along by the looks of it." The screwdriver slipped from my suddenly numb fingers, clattering against the concrete floor. Pregnant. My Ellie was pregnant. The word echoed in my mind like a bell tolling, both joyous and ominous. "Did she..." My voice cracked, and I had to clear my throat before continuing. "Did she look well?" Mrs. Abernathy's expression softened with something close to pity. "She looked tired, Jim. Real tired. And I don't think she found what she was looking for at that fair." She hesitated again, then added, "Janice from the drugstore said she saw her later, sitting in her car in the Walmart parking lot, crying something fierce all alone. That image, my daughter pregnant and weeping alone in a discount store parking lot, cut through me like a serrated blade. This wasn't what I'd wanted. Yes, I'd needed her to understand the value of money, to learn that resources weren't infinite, but I'd never meant for her to suffer like this. Had my lesson gone too far? That night, I couldn't sleep. I paced the small confines of my workshop, alternating between self-recrimination and rationalization. She made her choices, I told myself. This is part of the learning process. But another voice, one that sounded suspiciously like Margaret's, whispered, "She's still your little girl no matter what." By dawn, I'd made a decision. I wouldn't approach her directly, her pride wouldn't allow it, but I could help anonymously. I withdrew $100 from the emergency fund I'd kept hidden, one of the few resources I hadn't actually liquidated during my fake financial collapse. I folded the bills into the shape of a heart, something I'd learned to do when Ellie was small and delighted by such magical transformations of ordinary objects. On a plain note card I wrote, "For you and the little one on the way." I left the money in an envelope taped to the windshield of her car while she shopped at the local grocery store, then watched from a distance as she discovered it. She stood there for a long moment, the envelope clutched in her hand, looking around the parking lot as if the giver might reveal themselves. For just a second, her eyes passed over where I stood, partially hidden behind a newspaper at a bus stop, and I felt a jolt of recognition. Not that she saw me, but that I saw her. Really saw her, perhaps for the first time in years. Gone were the designer clothes and perfectly styled hair. Instead, she wore simple maternity jeans and a t-shirt that stretched over her swollen belly. Her face, free of makeup, showed the freckles she'd inherited from Margaret and had always tried to hide. She looked younger somehow, and simultaneously older, as if the stripped-away artifice had revealed both the girl she'd been and the woman she was becoming. I waited for a response to my gift, though I knew better than to expect one. Days turned to weeks, and weeks to months. The Kentucky summer blazed its way into fall again, leaves crunching beneath my feet as I walked the 3 miles between my workshop and my barely inhabited house. It was Mrs. Abernathy, once again, who brought me the news. This time she didn't bother with the pretense of a repair job or a baked good. She simply appeared at my workshop door, her expression a mixture of excitement and uncertainty. "Your daughter had her baby last night," she announced without preamble. "A healthy girl, 7 pounds even, born just after midnight at County General." My heart swelled and constricted simultaneously. A granddaughter. I had a granddaughter. "And Ellie?" I managed to ask through the tightness in my throat. "Is she well?" "She's fine," Mrs. Abernathy assured me. Then, with careful hesitation, "Jim, they say she registered the baby with just her name. No father listed. No grandparents either." The implication was clear. As far as official records were concerned, this child had only one family member in the world, her mother. No father, no grandfather, just a woman and her baby, facing the future together, alone. I nodded slowly, absorbing this final evidence of the gulf between us. A gulf I had helped create, with each silent day that passed since I'd begun this painful lesson. My granddaughter would grow up not knowing me. At least, not yet. Not until Ellie was ready to bridge the chasm between us, if that day ever came. That night I carved a small wooden duck, the first in what would become a collection waiting for a child who might never see them. And as I shaped the wood with my weathered hands, I wondered what kind of man creates such painful distance to teach a lesson about value. What kind of father purchases his daughter's growth with such profound silence? The morning of my 73rd birthday dawned with the kind of perfect autumn clarity that Kentucky saves for its most heartbreaking days. The trees outside my workshop window blazed in crimson and gold, as if nature itself were celebrating an occasion I'd planned to let pass unacknowledged. I had no parties to attend, no calls to expect, no gifts to unwrap, just another Wednesday in a long line of quiet days. I'd been awake since 4, a lifetime of early rising impossible to break even now. With coffee brewing on the hot plate, the cheap kind that tastes more like memories of coffee than the real thing, I sat at my workbench putting the finishing touches on a music box. It was the 30th item in what I'd come to think of as my granddaughter's inheritance. A collection of handcrafted wooden toys, puzzles, and keepsakes stored in a cedar chest I'd built specifically to hold them. A chest with her initials carved into its lid, EEE. Eleanor Elizabeth Elliott, though I'd never been told her name. In my mind, she was always little Eleanor, named for her mother, who was named for my mother. 3 generations of women I'd loved, connected by a name and divided by my choices. The radio played softly in the background, Glenn Miller's Moonlight Serenade drifting through the air like a visitor from another time. Margaret and I had danced to that song at our wedding, her white dress swirling around her ankles, her laughter bright as summer lightning. The memory was so vivid I almost missed the sound of footsteps outside my door. 3 knocks, precise and measured, not the hesitant tap of a potential customer, nor the confident rap of the landlord collecting rent. Something in between, deliberate, yet uncertain. I set down my sandpaper and glanced at the clock. 6:37 a.m. Too early for anyone but the truly determined. Through the thin curtain covering my workshop's single window, I could make out a shadow, the silhouette of a woman, and something smaller beside her. My heart stuttered painfully against my ribs. For a moment I couldn't move, frozen by possibility and fear in equal measure. Then, slowly, I rose from my bench, wiping sawdust from my hands onto my worn jeans. Each step toward the door felt like wading through molasses, time stretching and bending around this moment that suddenly seemed to hold the weight of all my carefully constructed plans. The door creaked as I pulled it open. I'd left it that way intentionally, a poor man's security system. And there, illuminated by the golden light of an October sunrise, stood my daughter. Ellie's face was thinner than I remembered, the soft curves of youth giving way to the defined angles of adulthood. Dark circles shadowed her eyes, but they were clear now, present in a way they hadn't been during our last encounter. Her hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, streaked with a few strands of premature silver that made her look startlingly like Margaret in certain angles of the light. She wore jeans, a plain sweater, and boots that were chosen for function rather than fashion. And in her arms, bundled against the morning chill, was a small child, a girl with a head of dark chestnut curls fast asleep against her mother's shoulder. We stood there, the 3 of us, separated by a threshold that felt wider than the Grand Canyon. No words passed between us, just the sound of our breathing. the distant call of a mourning dove, and the soft rustling of leaves tumbling across the parking lot. Ellie didn't say hello. She didn't wish me a happy birthday. She didn't apologize or explain her absence. Instead, she simply said, she wants to meet her grandfather. And then she stepped past me into the workshop, bringing with her the scent of baby shampoo and home-brewed coffee, so different from the expensive perfume that had marked her last visit. The child stirred in her arms, small fingers clutching at the collar of Ellie's sweater, but didn't wake. I closed the door behind them, suddenly self-conscious of my humble surroundings. The folding cot with its neatly tucked army blanket, the kitchenette cobbled together from salvaged parts, the single chair at my small table, nothing like the home where Ellie had grown up, with its comfortable rooms and carefully chosen furnishings. "You can put her down here," I offered, gesturing to the cot. "If you'd like." Ellie nodded and gently laid the sleeping child on the blanket, tucking her coat around her like a makeshift nest. The little girl sighed in her sleep, one tiny hand curling into a fist beside her cheek, and I felt something crack open inside my chest, a fissure in the wall I'd built around my heart. "She looks like your mother," I said softly, unable to take my eyes off the child's face. The delicate arch of her eyebrows, the faint dimple in her right cheek, the way her eyelashes fanned against her skin. Features I'd memorized in one beloved face and now saw echoed in another, separated by 2 generations and countless unspoken words. Ellie didn't respond immediately. Instead, she reached into her bag and pulled out an envelope, creased and worn around the edges, as if it had been opened and refolded many times. She placed it on my workbench, her movements careful, deliberate. "Before you say anything," she said, her voice steady but thin, like ice just strong enough to bear weight, "read this." I approached the envelope cautiously as if it might contain something volatile. In a way, I supposed it did. Inside was a photograph, an ultrasound image, the grainy black and white landscape of new life. It was dated 18 months earlier, bearing Ellie's name and patient number in the corner. I turned it over, and there, written in Ellie's neat handwriting, were words that stole the breath from my lungs. "She only exists because you taught me how to fall." My hands trembled as I looked up at my daughter, questions crowding my throat too thickly to voice any of them. But before I could find words, Ellie was moving toward the door, her steps quick and purposeful. "Her name is Margaret," she said, her hand on the doorknob. "Everyone calls her Maggie. She likes applesauce, hates peas, and she'll sleep through anything except silence." A ghost of a smile touched her lips. "Just like Mom." I started to speak, to ask her to stay, to explain, to give me a chance to understand the message she'd delivered with this visit. But she shook her head, cutting me off. "I need to go," she said simply. But she doesn't. Her eyes, so like her mother's, held mine for a long moment. "You wanted me to learn about value. Well, I've learned what matters. Now it's your turn." And then she was gone, the door closing softly behind her. Not with the dramatic slam of our last parting, but with the quiet finality of a chapter ending and another beginning. Through the window, I watched her walk to a modest sedan parked at the edge of the lot. A practical family car, nothing like the luxury vehicles she'd once favored. She didn't look back as she drove away. I turned to face the sleeping child, my granddaughter, left in my care like the most precious and terrifying gift I'd ever received. Maggie, named for the woman we'd both loved and lost. The child stirred, her eyelids fluttering open to reveal eyes the exact shade of Kentucky bluegrass in springtime. She blinked at me, a stranger in strange surroundings, and I held my breath, waiting for tears or fear. Instead, she smiled, a wide, gummy smile that revealed 2 tiny bottom teeth, and reached out a small hand toward me, as if she somehow recognized me, as if she'd been waiting to meet me all along. That night stretched into the longest of my life. Every creak of the old building, every distant car passing on the highway, every shift in the autumn wind seemed magnified in the quiet of my workshop. Maggie slept peacefully on my cot, surrounded by pillows I'd hastily arranged to keep her from rolling off. I sat in my single chair, watching her breathe, afraid to sleep lest she need something I wasn't ready to provide. I had nothing for a child, no diapers, no proper food, no crib or toys or soft blankets with colorful patterns. Just rough hands that hadn't held anything so delicate in decades, and a heart bruised by years of self-imposed exile. What was Ellie thinking leaving her daughter with me? Was this revenge for my financial deception? Or something else entirely? The photograph from the ultrasound lay on my workbench where I'd placed it, those 7 words staring back at me in the dim light. She only exists because you taught me how to fall. As the night deepened, Maggie stirred occasionally, small sounds escaping her lips like the cooing of doves. Each time I tensed, ready for the wail of a child discovering herself abandoned in a strange place. But she merely sighed and settled again. One tiny fist curled beside her face, dark lashes against cherub cheeks. In sleep, her resemblance to Margaret was uncanny. The same slight furrow between her brows, the same curve of her upper lip. Seeing my wife's features echoed in this tiny face was like watching a familiar landscape emerge from morning fog, both strange and achingly recognizable. By dawn, I'd made a decision. I couldn't care for Maggie in this place with its exposed wiring and hard surfaces and countless hazards for small, curious hands. I needed to take her to my actual home, the house I'd kept but rarely visited, where at least there were proper beds and a functioning kitchen and memories of what family meant. I bundled her into my coat, creating a makeshift carrier that kept her secure against my chest. She woke briefly as I settled her there, those bluegrass eyes blinking up at me without fear. "We're going on a little journey, Magpie," I whispered, the nickname appearing in my mind from nowhere. "Just you and your old grandpa." The walk to my house took longer than usual, each step measured to avoid jostling my precious cargo. Early risers in town gave us curious looks. Old Jim Elliot carrying what appeared to be a bundle of laundry, but was actually making small human noises. Mrs. Abernathy was watering her front garden as we passed. Her eyebrows nearly disappeared into her hairline, but she said nothing beyond a startled, "Good morning." Inside my house, dust motes danced in the sunlight streaming through windows I hadn't bothered to clean in months. Everything was exactly as I'd left it. Dishes stacked neatly in cabinets, books lined on shelves, Margaret's quilts folded over the backs of chairs. A museum to a life I'd stepped away from, preserved like an insect in amber. I laid Maggie on the living room sofa and built a barrier of cushions around her. "Don't move," I instructed her seriously, as if a child barely old enough to sit up might understand such commands. She responded by stuffing her fist into her mouth and drooling contentedly. While she was occupied, I searched the house frantically for anything that might serve as baby supplies. In the back of a linen closet, I found a box labeled "Ellie, Baby" in Margaret's neat handwriting. Inside were a few preserved items from my daughter's infancy: a yellowed cotton receiving blanket, a silver baby spoon, a stuffed rabbit missing one eye. Not enough for practical use, but their discovery felt like Margaret reaching across time to help me, to remind me that we'd done this before and somehow managed. I was searching the kitchen for something approximating baby food when I noticed a folded piece of paper that had been slipped under the front door. My name was written across it in Ellie's handwriting. With hands that suddenly felt clumsy, I unfolded the note. "She's your granddaughter. Her father disappeared when he found out I was pregnant. I needed to know if you were still my safe harbor. Now I do. If you want to see her grow up, meet me at the old lake cabin." The lake cabin, our family's refuge for generations, a simple structure on the shore of Lake Cumberland that had passed from my grandfather to my father to me. I hadn't been there since Margaret's diagnosis, when the doctor's grim timeline had made such escapes impossible. Later, I'd let Ellie believe I'd sold it as part of my financial charade, though in truth, I couldn't bear to part with it. That cabin held too many memories. Margaret teaching Ellie to swim in the clear waters, evenings spent playing board games by lantern light, mornings watching mist rise off the lake like the breath of some ancient being. I glanced at Maggie, now contentedly examining her own toes on the sofa. "What do you think, little one? Should we go find your mama?" She responded with a gurgle that I chose to interpret as enthusiastic agreement. The drive to Lake Cumberland took nearly 2 hours, Maggie secured in the back seat of my old Buick with a makeshift restraint fashioned from belts and blankets. I'd stopped at a general store for emergency supplies, diapers, formula, a plastic sippy cup with cartoon characters I didn't recognize. The cashier had given me a look that spoke volumes about an elderly man's competence in child care, but Maggie's sunny disposition as she babbled in my arms had silenced any overt concerns. Each mile closer to the cabin felt like stepping back in time. The road narrowed, civilization thinned out, and nature reclaimed the landscape in a riot of autumn color. Oak and maple trees formed a canopy overhead, their leaves drifting down to carpet the winding road. The air through the cracked windows smelled of pine and wood smoke and the mineral tang of lake water. When I finally turned onto the narrow dirt track leading to the cabin, My hands were trembling on the steering wheel. What would I find there? What version of my daughter awaited me? The entitled young woman who'd demanded financial support without gratitude? The angry stranger who'd spat on her mother's quilt? Or someone new? Someone shaped by 2 years of struggle and motherhood? The cabin came into view through the trees, its weathered logs and stone chimney unchanged since my childhood. Smoke curled from the chimney, confirming someone was inside. And there, sitting on the steps leading down to the dock, was Ellie. Her back was to me, her hair loose around her shoulders, her feet bare despite the October chill. She was staring out at the lake, where late afternoon sun transformed the water into a sheet of hammered gold. I parked and turned to check on Maggie, who had miraculously slept through the last bumpy mile of our journey. She blinked awake as if sensing we'd arrived, those remarkable eyes focusing on my face with what seemed like recognition. "We're here, Magpie," I whispered. "Let's go see your mama." Walking down the path to the cabin, carrying this small life in my arms, I felt every one of my 73 years, and simultaneously none of them. Fear and hope battled in my chest with each step. What waited for me wasn't just a confrontation with my daughter, but with the consequences of every choice I'd made since that January morning when she'd slapped down that credit card statement. Ellie must have heard our approach, but she didn't turn. Not until I was standing just feet away with Maggie making soft, questioning sounds against my shoulder. When she finally faced us, I saw what Mrs. Abernathy had meant about Ellie looking different. The change wasn't just in her simpler clothes or lack of makeup, it was in her eyes. Clear now, present in a way they hadn't been before, and they were wet with tears. Not tears of anger or bitterness, tears of something I'd almost forgotten existed between us. Longing. The kind of deep, aching need that transcends words, that lives in the marrow of bones and the chambers of hearts. She was crying for something lost, and maybe, just maybe, something found again. "You came," she said simply, her voice thick with emotion. "I came," I replied, equally simple. We both did. I held Maggie out to Ellie, this precious weight passing between us like a sacred offering. My daughter reached for her child with hands that trembled slightly, hands that once demanded designer handbags and now cradled something infinitely more valuable. As Maggie settled against her mother's chest, making those soft, contented sounds that seemed to be her primary language, I noticed the silver locket around Ellie's neck, her mother's locket, which I thought she'd pawned or lost years ago. The three of us stood there on the weathered dock, surrounded by the whisper of wind through pine needles and the gentle lapping of lake water against wooden pilings. Time seemed suspended, as if the universe itself was holding its breath, waiting to see what would happen next in this fragile reunion. "Let's go inside," Ellie finally said, her voice steadier than I expected. "It's getting cold." The cabin's interior was exactly as I remembered and somehow completely different. The same rustic furniture, the same Riverstone fireplace, the same braided rug Margaret had bought at a county fair 30 years ago. But now, incongruous signs of new life were scattered throughout. A portable crib in the corner, colorful plastic toys on the floor, tiny clothes folded in neat piles on the sofa. Ellie settled Maggie on a blanket spread across the rug and handed her a wooden rattle that looked handmade. I recognized the craftsmanship immediately. Simple but precise joinery, smooth edges, natural finish. It was one of mine, from the collection I'd been building in my workshop. "You found them," I said, nodding toward the rattle. "The toys." "Mrs. Abernathy told me," Ellie admitted, not meeting my eyes. "Said you'd been making them since Maggie was born. She helped me break into your workshop while you were at the grocery store last month. I needed to see for myself." The thought of Mrs. Abernathy, who struggled to open pickle jars without help, as a breaking and entering accomplice almost made me smile. Almost. "Why didn't you just ask me?" I said instead, lowering myself into the old rocking chair by the fire, my joints protesting the day's unusual activity. "Ask you?" Ellie's laugh held no humor. "After what happened between us? After you pretended to lose everything just to teach me some twisted lesson about money?" So she knew. Had known, perhaps for some time. The realization should have been shocking, but instead, it felt like the release of a long-held breath. No more pretending. No more elaborate deception. "How long have you known?" I asked quietly. "Since about 3 months after Maggie was born." She busied herself adjusting the baby's blanket, though it needed no adjustment. "I ran into Bill Stevens at the bank. He mentioned something about your special arrangement with the trust department. It didn't take much digging after that. Bill Stevens, the bank manager I'd known for 40 years, who'd helped me structure my finances to appear decimated while actually remaining largely intact. The one loose end in my carefully constructed fiction. And you didn't confront me? I couldn't hide my surprise. The Ellie I'd known 2 years ago would have stormed into my workshop, righteous fury blazing in her eyes, demanding explanations and probably compensation. I wanted to, she admitted, finally looking up at me. God, I wanted to. I was so angry I couldn't see straight for days. Planned exactly what I'd say, how I'd make you feel as small as you made me feel. She glanced at Maggie, who was now contentedly gumming the wooden rattle. But then I realized something. What's that? I asked, my throat suddenly dry. That it worked, she said simply. Your cruel, manipulative, loving lesson. It worked. The words hung between us, complex and contradictory, as our relationship itself. I didn't know whether to apologize or explain or simply sit with the weight of what she'd said. I was horrible, wasn't I? Ellie continued, her voice softer now. That day I came to your house with the credit card statement. I can still see your face when I demanded more money, like I'd struck you physically. You were lost, I said, choosing my words carefully. Not horrible, just disconnected from what matters. I was worse than lost. I was entitled, shallow. I thought I deserved everything without earning anything. She shook her head, as if still bewildered by her former self. Do you know what I did with that money? All those thousands? I shook my head. I'd seen the statement but never asked for details beyond what was listed there. I was trying to become someone else, she said. Someone important. Someone who mattered because of what she owned, not who she was. Her fingers absently traced the outline of the locket at her throat. I thought if I had the right clothes, the right car, the right address, if I could show up at the right restaurants with the right people, then maybe I'd stop feeling so empty inside. The crack in her voice on that last word opened something in my chest, a floodgate of emotion I'd been holding back for far too long. I crossed the room in 3 strides and did what I should have done that January morning. I wrapped my arms around my daughter and held her as if she were still small enough to be protected from the world's sharp edges. For a moment, she stiffened, as if unused to such contact. Then, with a sound that was half sob, half sigh, she collapsed against me, her forehead coming to rest against my shoulder, just as it had when she was a child seeking comfort after a nightmare. We stood that way, frozen in an embrace that bridged years of silence, while Maggie watched us curiously from her blanket on the floor. When Ellie finally pulled back, her face was wet with tears, but her eyes were clearer than I'd seen them in years. My biggest fear, she whispered, was that I'd become the kind of mother to Maggie that I was a daughter to you. Ellie, I started, but she shook her head. No, let me finish. I need to say this. She took a deep breath. When I found out I was pregnant, I was still living on credit cards and charm. The baby's father, she faltered slightly, then steadied herself. He wasn't ready for responsibility. Neither was I, really. But then, one morning, I woke up and realized I couldn't remember the last time I'd called you just to talk. Not to ask for money, not to complain about something, but just to hear your voice, to tell you about my day, to laugh about something silly. She moved to the window, looking out at the lake now turned silver in the early evening light. That's when I understood what I'd really lost. Not when the credit cards maxed out or when he left me, but when I realized I'd forgotten how to be a daughter. I approached her slowly as one might a wounded animal. I made mistakes too, Ellie. Big ones. I thought I could teach you about value by taking everything away. But my biggest bankruptcy was emotional. Hiding my limits from you, pretending everything was always fine even when it wasn't. The money was just a symptom. The real problem was the silence between us. She nodded, still gazing out at the water. I found something, she said quietly. In your workshop, when Mrs. Abernathy helped me break in, a box with an envelope inside. My heart stuttered in my chest. The box, the envelope with those 3 words written in my shaky handwriting, for when it hurts. Ellie turned and crossed to the small table beside the sofa. From its drawer, she withdrew that same envelope, worn now around the edges, the paper softened by frequent handling. She placed it in my palm, our fingers brushing in the exchange. I've read it 1,000 times, she said softly. But today, I finally understood. With trembling fingers, I opened the envelope and withdrew the single sheet of paper inside. My own handwriting stared back at me, the words I'd written in a moment of desperate hope 2 years earlier. If one day you find yourself lost, look for me. I'll be waiting in the place where love needs no receipt, in the depths of your heart. Simple words, nothing profound or poetic, just an old man's clumsy attempt to reach across a chasm he'd helped create. I read it over and over, Ellie whispered, her voice thick with emotion. But it took me until today to truly hear it. I folded the paper carefully and returned it to the envelope, unable to speak past the knot in my throat. Outside, twilight was settling over the lake, transforming the water into a mirror that reflected the first emerging stars. Inside, something equally profound was transforming between us, something too fragile yet to name, but too precious to ignore. Today, 18 months later, my life bears little resemblance to the one I'd carefully constructed during those 2 years of self-imposed exile. The small, cramped workshop has been exchanged for a home filled with laughter, chaos, and the thundering footsteps of a toddler discovering her world. Not my old house, we sold that one, too laden with ghosts of silence past, but a new place closer to town, with a yard where wildflowers grow untamed and a front porch wide enough for 3 rocking chairs, one large, one medium, one tiny, with cartoon princesses painted on the armrests. Maggie races through these rooms with the reckless abandon of a child who has never known anything but security. At nearly 2.5, she's a whirlwind of curls and questions, her vocabulary expanding daily with words that tumble out in that particular toddler cadence that treats every sentence like breaking news. "Gampa, look!" she shouts 20 times a day, demanding my attention for discoveries ranging from a peculiarly shaped cloud to her own reflection in a spoon. Her resemblance to Margaret grows stronger with each passing month. Not just the physical traits, those bluegrass eyes, the dimple that appears in her right cheek when she smiles, the slight tilt of her head when she's considering something serious, but in her spirit. She has her grandmother's quiet determination, her capacity for joy in small things, her tendency to comfort others before herself. Sometimes, watching her sleep, I swear I can feel Margaret nearby, delighting in this unexpected second chance for our family. Ellie has transformed too in ways both subtle and profound. Gone is the woman who measured her worth in designer labels and exclusive addresses. In her place stands someone both stronger and softer, a social worker at the County Family Services Department, helping young mothers navigate the same challenges she once faced. She comes home with stories of small victories and devastating setbacks, her eyes alight with purpose even on the hardest days. Sometimes she brings home letters from the girls she works with, teenagers trying to find their place in a world that often seems indifferent to their struggles. She reads them to me over dinner, her voice steady with the confidence of someone who has walked through fire and emerged not just intact, but illuminated. We're not wealthy, not in the way Ellie once defined it. Her salary and my modest retirement provide enough for comfort, but few luxuries. The trust fund I'd protected during my charade remains largely untouched, earmarked now for Maggie's education and future, with a significant portion directed to a scholarship fund for the children of single mothers. Ellie's idea, that last part. Money should work, she told me, not just sit in an account growing more money. Some mornings, when the dawn light filters through the kitchen windows and I'm preparing breakfast before the girls wake, I find myself talking to Margaret again, not with the desperate loneliness of those workshop days, but with a peaceful gratitude that feels like its own kind of conversation. "You should see her with Maggie, Mags," I whisper, while flipping pancakes shaped like misshapen animals. "All that love you poured into her, it's flowing right through to the next generation. Nothing wasted, nothing lost." I like to think Margaret hears me, that she knows the broken circle of our family has somehow mended itself into a new shape, different from the original, marked by its fractures, but whole nonetheless. A shape that includes the memory of her as vividly as the presence of us. Last week I slipped a note into Maggie's ladybug backpack before Ellie took her to daycare, just a small drawing of a heart with our initials inside. The first of many such messages I plan to leave for her over the years. Breadcrumbs leading to an understanding that might one day help her navigate her own adult relationship with her mother. Ellie found it when they returned home, and the look she gave me, part amusement, part recognition, part quiet approval, told me she understood exactly what I was doing. "Starting early with the life lessons, Dad?" she asked that evening as we sat on the porch, watching fireflies rise from the grass like earthbound stars seeking to rejoin the heavens. Just planting seeds, I replied, rocking gently in the chair that had become mine. Some lessons take a lifetime to fully bloom. She nodded, her gaze distant as she watched Maggie attempting to catch lightning bugs in the yard, small hands clapping at the air with determined focus. Do you ever regret it? She asked suddenly. The bankruptcy scheme, the 2 years of separation, all of it. I considered the question carefully, giving it the weight it deserved. Regret is too simple a word, I finally said. I regret the pain it caused, the time we lost. But I don't regret the outcome. I don't regret who we've become because of it. I hated you for a while, she admitted, her voice soft but not accusatory, just stating a fact, like commenting on the weather. I know. I hated myself more. I reached across the space between our chairs and took her hand. This grown woman who had once been my little girl and was now something even more remarkable. A person entirely her own, shaped by both love and loss, both privilege and privation. Pretending to be broke cost me my sanity for a time, I told her. But it saved you from losing your soul to emptiness, and it saved me too, from continuing to believe that being strong meant staying silent. Sometimes the most valuable lesson comes in the form of absence, and when you truly love someone, even silence teaches. Ellie squeezed my hand, then released it to wipe away a tear that had escaped down her cheek. Pretty expensive lesson, she said with a watery laugh. The most important ones usually are, I replied, watching as Maggie triumphantly captured a firefly, her small face illuminated by its glow as she peered into her cupped hands. Mama! Gampa! I got one! I got a star! She called, running toward us with her prize, careful not to squeeze too tightly, just as Ellie had taught her. What are you going to do with your star, Magpie? I asked as she reached the porch steps, her eyes wide with wonder at the tiny creature pulsing light against her palms. She considered this question with the profound seriousness only a toddler can bring to such matters. Then decisively, let it go home, she declared, opening her hands toward the darkening sky. We watched together as the firefly lingered for a moment, a farewell perhaps, or a benediction, before rising to join its kin in the twilight dance above our yard. Good choice, Ellie murmured, pulling Maggie onto her lap. The best things are the ones we hold gently enough to set free. I nodded, recognizing in her words an echo of the lesson I'd tried so desperately to teach her, now returned to me transformed by her own wisdom. The circle complete. The debt, if ever there was one, repaid in full. As night settled around our little family on the porch, I thought about value. Real value, not the kind that can be calculated on statements or measured in square footage or displayed on wrists and in driveways. The kind that reveals itself in a child's laughter, in a daughter's forgiveness, in the quiet peace of knowing that what matters most can never be bought or sold, only earned through the currency of presence, attention, and love. Some might call my deception cruel. Perhaps it was. But in that cruelty lived a kindness too profound to be delivered any other way. A kindness that looked like falling so that we could all learn to rise. Sometimes the hardest lessons come wrapped in silence. The words we never say, the boundaries we never set, the truths we hide behind our love. I pretended to lose everything to teach my daughter about value, but in the process, I nearly lost what was truly irreplaceable, our relationship. What would you have done? Would you have watched your child spiral into emptiness, funding their descent with your hard-earned money? Or would you have found the courage to let them fall, knowing that sometimes we must lose our way to find our true path? In our world of instant gratification and material excess, the greatest inheritance we can leave our children isn't money or possessions. It's the wisdom to recognize what truly matters. My daughter now understands that the most valuable things can't be bought with a credit card. Integrity, self-reliance, the joy of earning your place in the world, and the profound connection between generations. These are the true treasures that appreciate rather than depreciate with time. If this story touched your heart, or made you think about your own family relationships, please follow our channel for more stories that explore the complicated beauty of human connection. Like and share with someone who might need to hear that sometimes, love means having the courage to say no, even when saying yes would be infinitely easier. Thank you for listening to our journey of loss, learning, and the redemptive power of forgiveness.